Hey, Nick.
Hey, Jen.
What are you listening to this week? Welcome to Season 3 of What Are You Listening To? The weekly podcast created to foster community through music by sharing the stories behind the songs that soundtrack our lives. Some of the songs are old, some new, all good. I'm Jenn Tully, and this week I'm joined by Nick Morrison. Nick is an Amazon best-selling author, professional musician, composer, teacher, narrator, voice actor, YouTube creator, and music media consultant from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. He's toured throughout the United States, Canada, and Japan as a guitarist, worked as a session musician, and writer-composer for Warner Brothers, Universal Studios, Sony, MTV, HGTV, and HBO, just to name a few. This week, Nick and I are going to get to know each other through 4 songs that rock. 2 are his picks and 2 are mine. For the best listening experience, I recommend tuning into the show on Spotify. There, you can hear the show with the songs we discuss incorporated. You can also find the show on Apple, Amazon, or wherever you stream. But if you're not listening on Spotify, be sure to give the playlist a listen and then tune into our conversation. With that, let's get started. Nick, what are you listening to this week?
Hey, Jen. Firstly, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm super excited to be here.
I'm so happy to have you here. I've been waiting to do like a rock show, and you fully delivered.
I think this is going to be the one. Yeah, it's a really cool concept. I think this is such a neat way to get to know someone and a great way to share hopefully some new music with an interesting or interested audience other than sort of in my hometown or my home country or even my home region, right? So
exactly.
Yeah, with that, I might as well just jump right in, right? With the first song.
Do it. Yeah.
Okay. So the first song is by one of my favorite bands of all time. They are called The Tea Party, and they are from here in Canada, actually from my hometown of Windsor, Ontario. They're a couple years older than I am, but we actually went to the same high school, so we know a lot of the same people. And the song is actually kind of a two-parter, and the first part is called Haze on the Hills, which is an instrumental opening track which segues into the bulk, which is the Majestic song. And this is a fantastic track, and I can't wait for your listeners to hear it.
Oh, I'm so glad that you brought this song. This was a band that I was not familiar with. I had not heard of the Tea Party. And so I was I'm like, where have these guys been hiding? Like, how do I not know this music? Like, and you have to like fill me in. I did a little digging once I heard the 2 songs ostensibly, but like you said, they kind of like one leads into the other. I just kind of did a full rabbit hole dive into these guys because I loved it so much. And like to give our listeners a little bit of a heads up, like we definitely, like I teased in the intro, like this is a rock playlist that our listeners are going to get today. And we're also going to dive into a little bit of like prog rock today, which we don't get to often, sometimes because the tracks are long or there's a lot of instrumental. Prog rock is polarizing. Totally. And so I'm super excited to like dive into these bands. And I would say, I don't know, would you consider Tea Party proggy? I think they are.
I would definitely call them proggy. They're more on the progressive side of the real sort of classic rock sound. When people ask me, and you'll probably laugh, and you might have even read this when you were kind of diving down that rabbit hole, but when people ask me, well, what do they sound like? I kind of like, if you imagine Led Zeppelin with Jim Morrison from The Doors singing.
Yeah, we have the exact same note. I literally wrote, does Jeff Martin's voice remind you of Jim Morrison at all? Totally. And does the band sound like Zeppelin to you? That was my note.
Totally. I mean, I love Led Zeppelin, and they're really one of the very first bands that I ever really fell in love with and really was like, oh man, I need to play guitar. But I mean, they really kind of took what Led Zeppelin did with their later albums and their more progressive feel and their Eastern influences and really kind of wrapped it up a notch. And the band themselves kind of describe themselves as Moroccan roll, which I think is a real catchy little label. Because people like to put things in boxes, right? It's like, well, where do they fit? Of
course.
And I think that's one of the problems with the band that they have had in North America, because Canada and the US, and for those people that forget, I am in Calgary, Canada. But our kind of culture here is a little bit more in the box 4-minute playlist or 4-minute songs, radio friendly, these sorts of things. But in, South America and in Australia and in Europe, they're much more open to, or much more used to, more progressive sounding stuff, longer, a lot of different influences coming into the music. And the Tea Party's been super, super popular in Australia basically since they came out. It's, I think, their biggest market for them. Other than here in Canada, they had a couple radio hits, and in Europe as well. But they never really just found that traction here in North America that I think that they really deserve.
I agree. And I hope that listeners will take a deep dive like I did into this. And so this is from their Splendor Solace album. And I don't think this was their very first album, but I think this was their first major label album. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. Splendor Solace really was their major label debut on EMI. They originally had They originally had the Splendor Solace EP, which is about 6 songs from this album that they recorded and released independently on their own. I think there was only 1,000 copies, and then they might have done like a second pressing with another 500 or something like that. So collectors and real hardcore fans of the band like covet those CDs, discs, and vinyl. And then when they got the contract with EMI, they went in and kind of re-recorded everything and then added a few extra tracks. And forgive me, I don't remember exactly what they are because it's been quite a while. I mean, it came out in 92, right? But it really is
so good.
Yeah, probably one of my favorite albums. If you did go down that rabbit hole, there's another couple super, super amazing gems on that record that they still play live today.
Well, I dug a little bit too. Like I dug a little into the Sun Shower album, I think it was called, and Blood Moon Rising. Like I was looking at some of their other things. Stuff, yeah, some of the newer stuff. But this album ended up being my favorite. And there's a song on this album. So when the listeners go and check out the whole thing, I loved the song In This Time. I thought that was such a great, like that's the girl track on the album, maybe, right? Totally. Because it's the love song, but it's just like, I thought it was so beautiful. And I just thought that it was like that song for me was such a huge, and it was such a contrast to the way that the Majestic song rocks. This In This Time still rocks, but it rocks in a quieter way.
Yes.
And so I just I like I said, this was a band I was so happy to go down the rabbit hole of. And I know for other listeners out there that sometimes and I don't know why this is necessarily, but a lot of times the problem people have with prog rock bands has more to do with the voice of the lead singer than anything, right? I know that people that when I hear people complain about Rush or Jethro Tull, oftentimes it's because they don't like Geddy Lee and they just don't like the way the sound of the lead singer,
right?
Or Ian Anderson.
Taste in those cases.
Right. But I think that Tea Party is a nice entree in because we were just talking about, I think that Jeff Martin has such a pleasing voice that sounds really reminiscent of Jim Morrison.
Yeah, he's got what you would call either a low tenor or a kind of a high baritone voice, which is very different, especially if you think about the 90s when they were coming out. They were still coming, music industry in North America was really transitioning out of kind of hair metal and getting into more grunge and alt rock, which didn't necessarily feature those high tenor voices anymore, but there was still kind of in that mid tenor range, except of course, Eddie Vedder had a little bit more of a low growl, but it was something very, very different. And of course, if you saw any pictures, Jeff Martin looks a lot like Jim Morrison even.
Yeah.
And for the ladies in the audience, he's still single as far as I know. And that is, it's one of the draws, right? He's like that,
it is
black leather, long black hair, mysterious guitar player, singer. And he plays it up. And rightfully so. Use what you've got to help sell your product, right? And he does a great job of it.
Exactly.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and part of the appeal of becoming a rock star, am I right? I know that you're classically trained. You went to Berklee College of Music, but I have to imagine even for the serious artists, there's a part in the back of your head that's this might be a really cool way to meet the ladies.
Oh, totally. Right? I'm the first to admit the reason I started playing guitar. Other than being inspired by great music, but the whole reason I started playing was so that I could meet girls and talk to girls and maybe get a girlfriend,
Right.
So, yeah. Well, and that's one of those other things too. I really hate the moniker of serious musician or what would you call trained musician, this sort of
classically trained.
Well,
yeah.
So Berklee isn't a classical school. It's actually a jazz school.
Right.
So, and I was actually fully self-taught for probably 10 years before I ended up going there. So it's funny too, because like I went and I had to like hit up the remedial reading classes and start at ground zero to really get up to the level of kids that were 18, because I went a little later when I was like 24, 25. Okay. And so I'm in these classes with like these 18-year-old kids, and I'm like, okay, I got to work my butt off to make sure that I come up to the level where I need to be. But the whole serious musician thing, because like for me, it's not working music, it's not stressing music, it's playing music. Right? Like, let's have fun. Let's play.
Yes.
Like if you're stressed out, or you're sweating, or you're anxious, or you're angry, I mean, there's a time for angry stuff. But, if you're getting worked up over music, like I think maybe you're in it for the wrong reason. And this is just my own opinion. I mean, everybody can do their own thing. But I just, like I said, I like to have fun. I like to play. And I don't think people should take music so seriously. Music business, yes, take it seriously, because that's a different thing. But like music itself, play, have fun. Anyway.
No, I love that. And again, I think it's a big point of the show, right? That you can come on, I can have anybody on, and it forces me too to like pull some of the artists out of the deep, dark closet that sometimes I'm a little bit afraid to say like, ooh, I do like this, totally. Like it gives us all permission to just kind of explore. And like you said, and play and love what you love. And so I think that that's a great thing that I've never thought about it that way, about like they call it playing music, not working music or stressing music. Like it's so true. Yeah. Well, it's hard to transition off of the Tea Party, because I love this band. I'm hoping that listeners really do go check them out, because they were so cool. But I was super happy about your second pick, because it's got this band back in my rotation, which has been out for a while. I was obviously familiar, but was happy to like have them back on some playlists of late. So tell me what your second pick was.
Yeah, so the second pick is another one of my favorite bands. It's Dream Theater. And the song is A Change of Seasons.
Yes. Now, this is where I feel like we fully transition into like a prog, I think Dream Theater is like firmly in the prog rock lane. And I think even in the Rolling Stone did a fan poll a few years ago of like the best prog rock bands of all time. And I believe Dream Theater landed in the number 10 spot. I mean, like they're way up there. And your classic people were in there. Totally. Tool and, of course, Rush took the number 1 spot. King Crimson, like some of the classics that Genesis that we know of, Mars Volta of like early, more recent. But I think that Dream Theater is just like, again, it was so fun to like get back into this and dig on a 23-minute song. Like, when do you get to do that? Speaking of playing, right? Like, when do we allow ourselves to sit for one song, not an album, not a playlist, but indulge in a song, one for 23 minutes. I love that.
Yeah, very rarely.
Very rarely. Like, when can you do that? And I just think there's so much in this song. Like, even though it's a 23-minute song, I like found myself wishing it was like a 43-minute song.
Totally. Well, it's one of those things, and I think I wrote in the note to you when I kind of sent you my choices. Like, I cheated a little, right? Like, the first one was like, well, you get an instrumental intro and then the actual song itself. And really, if you look at the way the Change of Seasons is built, it's kind of like a classical concerto or an opus, like a magnum opus that is composed, where there's an opening instrumental section, which is called the Crimson Sunrise in this particular case. And it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the track. So you get a small snippet of each motif of the following 4 segments, right? Where it introduces the thematic element from part 2, which is Innocence, Carpe Diem, part 3, part 4, The Darkest of Winters, Another World, part 5, and then part 6, The Inevitable Summer, and then finally The Crimson Sunset, which is kind of the cycle. So the song itself, of course, is layered in so many meanings, right? So you can think of A Change of Seasons on the face of it, it's the cycle of life. You can think of the change of seasons in terms of literally the change of seasons of the world as it goes, as it spins around the sun. You can think of the change of seasons of, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a motivational / entrepreneurial speaker named Alex Hermosi, but he talks about seasons of your entrepreneurial journey, right? Or seasons of your musical journey where, you're born and then you have your first attempt and then second attempt and so on and so forth. So you kind of get these seasons, these 4 to 5 year or 5 to 10 year blocks in your life where you should be celebrating and getting excited and moving on to the next thing, not necessarily sad that old block is over, and so there's a lot of meaning in there. And of course, Mike Portnoy, the drummer, wrote the lyrics to this song, and he based it on a lot of his personal experiences, the loss of his mother, the birth of his kids, friendships dying and new friendships starting, these sorts of things. So there's a lot of really cool meaning in it.
And you can feel all of that too. Like, I feel like when I'm listening, like, not only do I get the story part of it, but you almost feel like them transitioning through this song, through the different movements in this one song. And I loved the Carpe Diem section in this. Yes. This was one of my favorites, not just for sort of the Dead Poets Society references and things like that, but I just love the messaging there. Cherish your life while you're still alive.
Right.
We can hold for the future, but there may not be one. I mean, that's some like, for a lyrics person, like, that's the kind of stuff I live for, right? Is like finding those gems where you're just like, yes. I had a guest on a few weeks ago, and we decided he coined a great phrase. It was called slogan lyrics, like t-shirt slogan lyrics, like when you can find those, like somebody has put together, a turn of phrase that sums up something you've wanted to say forever, but just couldn't find the right combination of words. And then, like a band like this nails it, and then I think like there's so many interesting things again going on in this song, but like, I'm curious to you again, as a musician, a working musician, somebody that teaches music, somebody that writes about music, somebody that's experienced music in other countries. Like, the thing that strikes me so much about specifically this song and this album and Dream Theater, but a lot of the prog rock bands, is all of the different time changes that go on in songs like this, or that bands like this seem so comfortable with. And as a non-musician, which everyone that's listened to the show knows that I am, that seems impossible to me. Like, how do you navigate a song that's got, I lost track of the time changes. You know what I mean? There were so many.
Totally.
Like, how do you signal that? Like, does it happen magically when you're recording? Like, talk to me a little about that.
I think is the answer to that. But yeah, so like, I mean, if you're in a studio recording, obviously it's like, you think of the studio like a laboratory or a kitchen, right? So typically in bands like Dream Theater or in bands that I've worked in previously, like, you have things that are worked out. You write parts, you pre-program, write down, right, your parts that are happening, and you record them in sequences. And so even though the final product, when you listen to it, changes time signatures many times through and many times over, you're really listening to a combination or a culmination or a splicing together of many smaller mini sessions, right? So there's a great story from long ago. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with The Who, right?
Of course,
and Pete Townsend was wanting to write more progressive material, and he was looking, I think it was Tommy, and they, kind of commissioned them, or they were talking about writing this rock opera. And he's like, I don't know how to write a song longer than 3 minutes. Because that's where they came from, right? Like that real kind of punk DIY ethos. And the producer or their manager was like, Pete, just take 2-3 minute songs and put them together. And that's why I love Change of Seasons. You've got like 6 individual songs. Like if you split them up, you can listen to those sections just as their own individual little songs. And that's kind of what happens. And then once it's all written, recorded, everything's edited and put together, then it's a matter of really memorizing, internalizing, and then rehearsing it as a standalone piece. And that just becomes habit. Once you put those habits and you memorize it, and it comes from the heart and it comes from the head, it just, it comes out, and it takes time. Yeah. But it feels can be like done.
Doing that live feels like the scariest thing ever to me, like operating for sure without a net.
Oh, totally. But again, you have fun with it. And I think there's a lot of a focus on, especially in prog rock circles or kind of Dream Theater, like prog metal, where, most of the fans listen to it. It's like, it's got to be perfect every single time. And everything has to be note perfect and absolutely flawless. And it's like, well, but again, that kind of defeats the purpose of live music. You know, you have to be able to give yourself some leeway to make mistakes, number one, and be okay with them, just letting them go. And then and C, kind of improvising and have a little bit of fun. There's less room when you have like a very constructed piece of music. But I've seen Dream Theater live a dozen or so times, and every time I've not seen them play a Change of Season every single time, but I think 2 or 3 times I've seen them perform it, and it's basically the same but a little bit different every time, which to me is really exciting.
Yeah, that's the magic. I feel like that's the magic of live music. And I think again, that's another reason I loved this particular album too, is that you did get some of those, you know, tracks that were recorded live. Yeah. I love, of course, we spoke of this a little bit earlier in the show, so I imagine this is probably a favorite of yours too, but I just love that Led Zeppelin medley.
Isn't it great?
Where it goes, you know, The Rover, Achilles' Last Stand, Into the Song Remains the Same, which is just like, phenomenal. I could listen to it on repeat over and over.
Cool thing about that whole EP, right, is the reason that they released it, and this kind of ties in again a Change of Seasons. They had lost their longtime keyboard player, and you know, John and Kevin were best friends growing up as kids on Long Island, and it got to that point in their career, and he's just like, I'm done with touring. I don't want to be part of the band anymore, and he left. And they were auditioning new keyboard players, and they had finally found Derek Shrinian, and they hadn't hired him as a full-time member of the band. He was still kind of like a sideman at that point. And so this really, to me, kind of captures that moment in time. Again, you know, mourning for the period of time that has just passed, and really looking forward and being excited about what's to come. And you know, the piece of music does that, but then the rest of the album, they did like a real special live club date where they performed like all of those covers, and that was Derek's sort of first introduction to the Dream Theater fandom. And what a great way to have him introduced to the band, because like the Led Zeppelin stuff, the Elton John cover, the big medley that's at the end, so cool.
It's so good. So again, another album that is so worth checking out. And as we're talking about bands that transitioned through some members for various reasons, we'll head into my first pick.
Totally.
Which we're kind of going to stay here in the prog land for a minute. And this is a song I've wanted to feature on the show since the very beginning. And I've not had the right opportunity. And so I'm so happy to be finally allowing this song to breathe on the show. My first pick this week is a song called Tropez by Pink Floyd. Now, this is a very strange choice as a favorite Pink Floyd song. Totally. I understand that. Especially off this album. So this is from the Metal album from 1971. As I mentioned, it's my favorite Pink Floyd song. And in that same Rolling Stone poll that I mentioned earlier, I think Pink Floyd took the number 2 spot. I want to say they were behind Rush in like the reader poll of best prog rock
Sounds
bands.
About right,
they were 2 or 3. They were pretty high on the list. But this is like squarely, I don't know. I don't even know that I would consider this song really a proggy song, but it's from a proggy band.
Yeah, totally. Well, and that's part of what prog is, to me, what is so exciting about it. It's like those bands give themselves license to say, hey, we want to write it was the 60s or beginning of the 70s, but like, we want to write a 60s surfy, boppy, romantic dream kind of tune. All right, cool, let's do it, you know?
Yeah.
Or we want to write, you know, something that's off the cuff and sounds like Tin Pan Alley, or something real left field metal, whatever it happens to be. And it's like, again, why not? We're playing music. Let's have some fun with it. And Saint-Tropez is, it's a very odd choice. I saw that and I was like, weird. So my question to you though, is like, what makes this your favorite Pink Floyd track, I guess off that album, or maybe in general?
So Metal is my favorite Pink Floyd album, which is also a strange choice. Not that I'm denying like the brilliance of Dark Side of the Moon or like any, like I'm a Pink Floyd fan. It's my husband's favorite band. So I'm constantly immersed in Pink Floyd. Yeah. And so I love this song primarily for the wordplay in the lyrics. I think that this is like a masterclass in clever wordplay.
Interesting.
And I think it's so different than anything else that Pink Floyd does. And so I like this one because I think that it gives you you get to experience Pink Floyd differently, right? A different side, the dark side of the band, the light side of the band, actually. This is the light side.
Yeah.
But if you're only familiar with like the laser light show version of Pink Floyd, like there's so much more there. You know,
this
like
is
there's
an
so
earlier
much
time
more
too, right?
Yeah, this is before Dark Side of the Moon.
Before Dark Side.
Yeah.
When arguably the band was getting along better, maybe.
Right.
And of course, this was only written, Gilmour didn't write any of this lyric or music. It was entirely written by Roger Waters.
Yeah.
Which again, to me, is like, that's really cool to have a band member, like it harkens back to the Beatles, right? Where there would be a McCartney piece or a Lennon piece or a Ringo Starr piece, right?
Yep.
You know, not that Octopus's Garden is a masterpiece by any means, but it is a fun song. But to me, this song kind of is reminiscent of that. Like, when I
agree.
When I first heard it, and even because I reviewed it before the show today, I was even listening to it again, and I was like, I wonder if this was Pink Floyd's answer to the Beatles.
Yeah, I've thought that before too, because I've not like necessarily put it with Octopus's Garden specifically, which I think is a great comparison, but not. I don't think so at all. I think it's actually the perfect comparison. And, I think like, again, the silliness of this, the wordplay, it feels so fresh to me. And I think sometimes Pink Floyd can feel heavy and it can feel dark, and there's a time and place for it. I think even when you're thinking about this album, Fearless is the big hit off of this album. Fearless is the one everybody knows, and it's also a great song.
Totally.
But this one to me is just, it's fun, and you don't hear fun and Pink Floyd in the same sentence too often. So I think that's why this is my favorite. And I've always loved this lyric, and I think Pink Floyd is great at like poking fun. Also, I think they're incredibly intelligent gentlemen as a band. And so I love the line where they say, born in a home with no silver spoon, I'm drinking champagne like a good tycoon.
Right? Yeah,
just always, since I was a kid, since the first time I heard that, I was like, I love that. To me, that's like, yep, we made it, and now we do not care about the consequences or what we look like, or if people think we're too rough or scruffy. Like, we can drink champagne with the best of them. We've arrived, like, I've just always thought that was such a cool statement.
Totally. And musically, it's just, it's very interesting to hear. I don't know exactly how I would class it, but like a more almost kind of early century American style Tin Pan Alley Ohm-esque kind of arrangement, right? Like this, there's jazz chords that they play. There's more than sitting on the root and moving like with so what we would call a pedal bass, and then an implied tonality by just moving power chords around that same tone center. So you actually get this much more, and this, Pink Floyd fans are going to hate me for saying this, but like a more melodic approach to songwriting than they usually had, at least up until that point. And that's not really what I mean, but that's the best way to express it.
No, it makes sense. It makes sense.
It's very cool to hear it, and I'm glad you picked it, because I was like, like I said, it was out of left field, but I was like, oh, okay, this is cool. Let's dig into it, right?
Let's throw it in there. Let's throw it in there. And and I love too that you get the instrumental at the end of this song versus the beginning. That's another thing that I've always loved about Saint-Tropez.
Yeah.
Well, and then to close out our playlist today, I'm hoping that this is sort of like my tea party for listeners, because I don't know how many people are familiar with this band. I recently was turned on to them by a friend of mine who's a big guitar guy and a past guest on the show too, Robert Neff. And I cannot stop listening to this band. This is a song called Chimney by the Southern River Band. And these guys, I am just freaking in love with. They're an Australian band, and they remind me of like the way I felt when I first heard like Wolf Mother or Royal Blood. Maybe a little bit of like the darkness, but without the camp. You know, like they're just like, it's just rock, like from the very beginning.
Rock and roll.
I love it. Were you familiar with this band?
I had never
you heard these guys?
Okay. And honestly, it's funny because when I heard them and I heard the thing, I was kind of like, where have these guys been all my life? Yeah. Number one. And then I kind of find out that like they're pretty new, and they're not like I think they're still independent. Like I don't think they've really made it, quote unquote, yet. But like I feel like this is, 1971 AC/DC Bon Scott era, getting ready to explode. Out of Australia, of course, there's that comparison, but I feel like they do have they have a lot of that same aesthetic, like just amps cranked to 11. Let's get down and dirty. If anything, and it's funny because at first, before I read them, I was like, I think these guys might be like a Canadian version of AC/DC.
Yeah.
And then I saw the picture and I was like, oh yeah, they're Canadian for sure. Cause dude's got like a big mullet and like a handlebar, 1970s porn stash. And I'm like, oh, these guys gotta be from like, Saskatchewan or from like Calgary or something. And I'm like, oh, they're from Australia. Okay. Well, that makes sense. But yeah, what fun.
So good. They kind of reminded me too, like looks wise, when we're talking about like a rocker and their lead singer sort of owning it. Like without the politics, I was also getting very like Ted Nugent vibes, right?
Totally,
like, like he's got his shirt off, he's got the tight pants, like they're shredding the whole time. Like, and I think this is their second album, but it's definitely one of my favorites that they have. And it was released in 2019. There's a great song. They have another song called Second Best that I love, a song called Stan Quaylen that's awesome. Chasing After Love. I mean, like definitely listeners, if you are not familiar with the Southern River Band, please go check them out if you want to rock. I think
very
they're
cool. It's interesting too, because finding a band like this kind of earlier in their career where they haven't had their big humongous breakout record that everybody knows yet. Like, because you mentioned The Darkness, right? Once A Thing Called Love came out, it was like, boom, everybody knew who The Darkness was.
Yep.
I suspect that's still yet to come with these guys, and I feel like it's probably going to take a producer with a good amount of finesse to kind of let them be who they are, but also just kind of whittle them down and kind of shape them just a touch, just to clean them up. Not necessarily their image or their content, but just in terms of like songwriting and arrangement. Because my only nit with this particular song, and it's not even a bad thing, because I am a guitar player and I love playing guitar and I could sit down and like, let's jam out for 25, 30 minutes. Right. But I found that it was a little bit heavy. I'm going to use a term that your listeners probably haven't heard before. Riff salad.
Ooh, tell me.
And what I mean by that is basically a collection. So sometimes when young songwriters start working and writing their songs, you'll get riff A, riff B, riff C, riff D, riff E, riff F, lyric, riff G, riff H, and they keep going, and it's just like piling more and more riffs on top of another, and there's not really another harken back or call back to that riff, except they do, but it's kind of a longer, more drawn out experience where you've got to hit that riff, again at, I think it was like the 6-minute mark where they kind of came back to the original riff. It's not even 6 minutes long, but anyway, very cool. And like I said, small nit, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with these guys over the next few years.
Well, and it's interesting. It's always interesting for me to hear, like, when we have Don Cento on the show too, like from producers, right? Because especially producers that are also musicians, because I think that they use a different part of their brain. I mean, you can tell me, like, do you have a different part of your brain on when you're playing versus when you're producing?
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When you play, it's much more visceral and much more gut. Like, things happen, and often this sounds weird, but like, you don't use your brain really. It just comes out. Whereas you're producing, you're sitting and you're thinking and you're analyzing. It's the difference of speaking day to day or sitting down to write an essay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would think. And I think that stands to reason. Like, I think part of what I love about Southern River Band is kind of like, this sounds silly and I don't mean to be demeaning to them at all. They're obviously like great musicians, great guitarists, but it almost feels like the first time I heard them, I felt like I was back in college, like seeing a friend's band. Totally. One of my girls was like, hey, my new boyfriend plays in this band. Let's go see them, and that's what it felt like. The first time I turned them on, I'm like, oh, this is like my girlfriend's, like her new boyfriend's in this band. And so I did love that sort of childlike, like we're just having fun quality. And I think you're right though. Like, I can't wait to see what happens when somebody gets their hands on these guys and really says, like, we want to give you enough like runway to play, but can channel them in a way that feels like really like tight and productive, not that what they're doing isn't, but I feel like that's, like, you're right. That'll kind of be the next like level up for these guys.
Well, that's it, right? It's like, as much as musicians, we want to be like, we want to have the freedom to do what we want to do. There is a time and a place for that, but there's also a time and a place for the really tight 3.5-minute song that is perfect for the radio. And they're different animals, and I don't think one is better than the other. They're just different.
Yeah, time and place. It just, it's like on any given day, what you're going to pull out of your record collection, know, like I could one day pull a Dolly Parton album, and then the next day pull a Beastie Boys album, and then the next day pull, a Led Zeppelin album. Totally. Like, probably in the same day I've done that. Not even like in a week. So totally. I think that, that also is part of the fun of loving music and playing music and finding new music and, then kind of going down that rabbit hole. It's sort of one of the things I love most about not only the show, but just music in general, like getting to find those new bands and just kind of follow them and their influences and see where it takes me. Well, Nick, thank you so much for sharing what you're listening to this week. I have been dying to do a rock show, and you completely brought it for me this week.
Awesome. Well, you're welcome. As I said, thank you for having me. It's been fun, and I really appreciated finding a brand new band that I can be like, yes. I like a brand new band, which I haven't done in 5, 6, 7 years, right? Of course.
Well, same with me, with Tea Party.
Yeah, there you go.
We each delivered one another a new band to obsess over for the rest of the year.
Yeah, totally.
Well, listeners, to learn more about Nick, please check out his guitar lessons and find links to his books and music. You can follow him on his YouTube channel at youtube.com/samuraiFingers. I'm going to spell that for you because I had a hard time spelling samurai. I'm going to go ahead and admit that.
Fair enough.
SAMURAIFINGERS. So Samurai Fingers on YouTube is Nick's channel, and everything you need to know to get better acquainted is on that link. As always, please be sure to follow, download, and share this show. And if you love listening and love this episode, please drop a review on Apple or Spotify for us. It really does help. And last but not least, to stay informed on all things Super Awesome Mix and What Are You Listening To, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Super Awesome Mix. Thanks for listening, and please join me again next week to find your new favorite song.